course, you know and I know that when we look around the world, there is lots of beauty, but there's also a whole lot of sadness, hurt, heartache, and brokenness. So how does the Bible make sense of going from the perfect world that we've just seen to a world that we live in now, which is far less than perfect? Well, it begins with an angel. The Bible says that as well as creating all the physical beings, God also created spiritual beings. Now, we don't know very much about them, but we may call them angels. And God created one of them to be more beautiful than all the rest of the angels. He was known as the Shining One. Now, it seems that the angels had a period of time whereby they could choose to either follow God or go their own way, just like Adam and Eve had the time to choose to follow God or not. Well, this angel, known as the Shining One, chose to rebel against God. The Bible says that he became proud. He had an ambition to be like God. And because of this rebellion, he was thrown out of God's perfect paradise and down to the earth. Now, while on earth, what he was trying to do was get all the rest of creation to follow him instead of following God. So the Shining One, well, he's also known as Satan or the devil, and he began to tempt Eve. He began by questioning what God says, and we read all this in chapter 3 of the Bible. First of all, he caused Eve to doubt. He said this: "Did God really say you must not eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden?" That's the question he asked. And Eve replied with these words: "Of course we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we're not allowed to eat. God said, you must not eat it or even touch it. If you do, you will die." Now, Eve did really well in trying to quote to Satan what God had said. But the problem is she added a little bit. God hadn't ever said anything about touching it. But the mistake opened the door for Satan. And he called God a liar. He denied God's goodness. He said God wasn't looking out for their best interests. Here's what Satan said to Eve: "You won't die," the serpent replied to the woman. "God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil." You know, Satan's plan of deception had worked. He convinced Adam and Eve that she should choose to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, Eve ate the fruit, and so did Adam. And now they had disobeyed God, and they'd rebelled against God. You remember, they'd broken that moral law. But was it really so bad that they just ate a piece of fruit? Well, the truth is, it was that bad. Do you remember back to God putting those physical, moral, and spiritual laws in place? Do you remember how we saw that every time you've got a law, every time you break a law, there's also a consequence? Well, suddenly, Adam and Eve felt guilt and shame. And they tried to cover themselves up with leaves, but God saw right through it and right into their hearts. You know, God always sees right into our hearts. He knew that they doubted him. And he knew because they believed that God was not looking after their best interest, but instead they'd chosen to go their own way, and they'd chosen to believe Satan. They believed a lie. But now, instead of owning up, they were trying to hide, and they were trying to blame each other. So let's try and understand exactly what happened. I'm going to use this little bridge illustration again. God said these words. Do you remember back in chapter 1? "If you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you are sure to die." Now, the consequence of breaking this moral law was death. When the Bible speaks about death, it means separation. And here's what this separation had. It was 3 parts. It meant death to a friendship. That is, God and Adam and Eve at first were both perfect. They could be friends. But as soon as they ate that fruit, Adam and Eve were no longer perfect. They became sinful. And because God is perfect and they were sinful, the friendship bridge between God and Adam and Eve had to be broken. Because God must be separated from anything that is not perfect. There had been death to their friendship. Second of all, there was separation one day of body and spirit. Now, right there and then, Adam and Eve didn't just drop down dead. Satan was right in that much. But one day they would die. Just like a flower, when it's cut out from the ground, it one day withers and dies. So we all know that one day we die and we move on from this life. One day, Adam and Eve's bodies would decay and die, and their spirits would leave and live on for all eternity. But it also meant separation from God, not just there and then, which was true, but separation forever and ever. You know, because Adam and Eve were bodies with spirits, that is, eternal spirits, they would go on living. But they would also one day be forced to live separated from God, in a place the Bible calls hell, a place separated from God's love and God's goodness. You know, death, separation, is such a terrible consequence of sin. Well, Adam and Eve, they tried to cover themselves up. They tried to make themselves acceptable before this perfect, holy God. But as we saw, it just didn't work. This explains why we live in a broken world, and things have just got worse and worse from this point. Well, was all hope lost? Is it only bad news? Does the Bible only have bad news? Well, creation was no longer perfect, because sin had now entered into it. It was cursed, and slowly, over time, things were getting worse and worse. But because God is so powerful, he didn't abandon Adam and Eve, but instead he made them a promise. This was God stepping in to save the day. God made a promise to deal with the mess that Adam and Eve had made. And it would be through someone suffering death in their place, in the place of the human beings. And to illustrate this, God made clothes for Adam and Eve, which meant the death of an innocent animal and the shedding of its blood. You see, this sounds kind of bad to us, but what was happening was an innocent animal was dying in the place of Adam and Eve to provide a covering for them so they could be right with God. You know, this is the first of many pictures throughout the Bible of our need of a covering and our need of an innocent one to die in our place. Well, finally, we see that their friendship was lost. Adam and Eve, they were sent out of the garden, which was actually really kind. Because do you remember there was another tree that God had put in the garden? A tree called the tree of life. Now, if they'd have eaten from that tree, they would have continued to live in their sinful state, separated from God forever and ever. And that would have been awful.